Heads up, this episode gets right into a discussion about suicide and continues on to talk about depression and anxiety. Please listen with care. If you need support, we've got resources listed in our show notes.
I think I was very afraid to admit that I was struggling personally in my first year because I was surrounded by people who I thought were succeeding, like to the highest degree. And I thought something was just like, I'm just not cut out to be at this institution.
This is In Our Heads, a TVO Today podcast about generation distress. I'm Tiffany Lam.
My name is Sahar. I use she, her pronouns. I am a fourth-year student. I study human bio, psychology, and immunology.
Sahar Mahmoodian was a first-year university student when COVID-19 shut down Ontario's schools. She goes to the University of Toronto. I wanted to kick this episode off with Sahar's feelings there because, well, I could kind of relate to them. And that thought loop of not wanting to show that you're having a hard time, subsequent negative self-talk, assuming others' realities, and comparing myself to others, well, not to be dramatic, but it's a spiral that can end in really dark places. I remember I wasn't even 8 years old when I'd heard about students ending their lives. I remember seeing those news stories and my mom sternly telling me that nothing was ever that bad, that I could talk to her. And unfortunately, not everyone gets that reminder or intervention. Sahar wasn't even a full month into her first semester in September 2019 when she heard that a student had died on campus. She doesn't remember where she was. It was 4 years ago now. But she does remember how hearing about it made her feel.
It was definitely very jarring, especially as like a new student coming in. But the discussions about how poorly U of T students' mental health was long-standing.
It was the third student death at that building, the Bayan Center, that year.
And so I was devastated when I heard about the suicides on campus, but I can't say I was shocked, which is horrible, but especially because some of them were at the Bayan Center, which is like a math and engineering building. Like those programs are rigorous.
Media reports didn't confirm this part, but a Reddit post says that those 3 suicides happened from the same spot. The post also said that, quote, many people witnessed this latest one. U of T put up temporary barriers at areas of elevation at the Bayan Center in 2019 as a response to the suicide attempts. But maybe it wasn't all that necessary anyways. U of T had canceled in-person classes by March 2020. Did you ever remember hearing from, staff about the suicides at all?
Not that I can think of. I don't think I spoke enough to staff at the time. Mm-hmm. And the staff I knew at the time were also teaching classes of 1,000 people, so it really should have been on them to say something. I will say that I knew somebody who was in a course and they had to book an appointment with a professor because in class the professor made a suicide joke.
Despite the lackluster acknowledgement to students of what had happened, the University of Toronto isn't necessarily trying to turn a blind eye to the tragic events either. Campus police track, quote, reportable incidents and flag them to the school every year through a report. Those reports say that there have been a total of 20 suicides or suicide attempts since 2017. There have also been an average of 46, quote, mental health acts a year since 2017. But the report doesn't exactly define what counts as a mental health act. Now, U of T Media Relations said those stats could be a student, faculty, or someone completely unaffiliated with the school. Before we go further, I want to say that this episode is not meant to be a U of T takedown. It's meant to be a case study about new approaches to mental health. And examining U of T felt timely to me because At the beginning of fall 2022, the school publicly announced that they were going to do mental health care better, as 100% of their students were returning to campus full-time. A September 2022 press release reads, "We're here for you. How U of T is supporting students' mental health now and in the future." In this episode, I want to look at the new approaches U of T took and what we can learn from them. And later, we'll rethink academia's approaches to learning and hear about strategies to better support mental health. Stay for the real how-tos at the end. But first, some context. U of T's initiative to do mental health care better came after a task force on student mental health was assembled back in the spring of 2019.
We've made great progress.
That's Professor Sandy Welsh. Professor Welsh oversees student life outside of the classroom at U of T.
My pronouns are she and her. And as Vice Provost students, I have a broad portfolio where I am responsible for all three campuses in terms of how we're supporting our students' mental health and other co-curricular, extracurricular activities.
Professor Welsh was on the task force and now is part of seeing through the 21 recommendations she helped make to the administration on how to improve student mental health on campus.
We have about 80% of those recommendations that are either complete or well underway, and we're continuing to move forward on that. But I note even when a recommendation may be sort of, quote, complete, we know we have to continue to go back to it, continue to make sure it's working.
One of the recommendations was to simplify pathways to care to increase accessibility to resources and supports. U of T has promised a new approach that will do just that.
So I'm Andrea Levinson. I go by she, her pronouns. I'm the Director of Psychiatric Care at our Health and Wellness Center on the St. George campus at the University of Toronto.
Dr. Levinson is also a staff psychiatrist at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, also known as CAMH. She's been the clinical lead of U of T's mental health care redesign since 2021. She stressed that single-session, same-day appointments are now always available to students.
That appointment will start to dig into where they're at today. There won't be a kind of long, extended intake process where the student will feel maybe they've spent an hour with someone and they haven't got a whole lot out of it.
Which, to be honest, sounds like the process I went through when I was 18, at a different school, but still. Dr. Levinson said that same-day appointments are now available thanks to a new model of mental health care that U of T has implemented, stepped care. All kinds of mental health providers, psychiatrists, therapists, and social workers have name-dropped stepped care to us throughout our reporting. All of them have said this would be their preferred system. Stepped care calls for essential intake where people can get a first appointment easily and then be directed to a range of options for care. Navigating between the steps should be easy. This glowing consensus goes as far up as the Mental Health Commission of Canada. The commission currently looks to ensure quality mental health care nationwide. It's helped implement stepped care in the Northwest Territories, Nova Scotia, and most recently, Prince Edward Island in November 2022.
It's much more flexible and it's very focused on what the student or the client brings in terms of motivation, in terms of readiness, in terms of what the student's cultural orientation and frame is, and then adapts to meet the student where they're at.
At this stage, Dr. Levinson couldn't confirm whether their first year of implementation showed the results they wanted.
It's early days, right? Yeah, it's early days.
But she believes reimagining mental health care on campus is crucial, given the number of young adults who go to post-secondary school.
Now we've got data showing, I think, well above 70%, approximating 80% of all transitional youth are engaged in the post-secondary environment. So that's where students are working, playing, sleeping. That's where they are.
Last episode, experts told us that mental illness often develops between the ages of 14 and 25. And so Dr. Levinson believes that colleges and universities are not considered as critical a space for mental health care as they could be.
Very often, post-secondary has been left out in terms of thinking through mental health and healthcare delivery.
U of T implementing stepped care may seem encouraging. It directly addresses the persistent problem of wait times for youth counseling appointments. Back in 2019-2020, the Investigative Journalism Bureau partnered up with a global trend tracker firm called Real-Time Interactive Worldwide Intelligence. They found that a third of student respondents said they waited weeks, if not months, for their first counseling appointment at school. 80% of students said a follow-up appointment took weeks more to get. The problem has been snowballing for years now, too. The IJB also found that over the past 10 years, more and more students have been reaching out for help. Between 2013 and 2020, requests to see a therapist or counselor went up by over a third at U of T. Out of the 40 Canadian and American post-secondary schools the IJB got numbers from, almost all of them reported more requests for counseling appointments. But to bring it back to the U of T case study for a moment, Sahar says she hasn't seen how the U of T revamp has improved the service that she uses.
I would argue that the accessibility services office has declined in quality since I first started using it.
Sahar told me that this past year has been more difficult to get in touch with accessibility services. She hasn't seen how stepped care has improved other kinds of mental health support.
Although I'm confused as to why it wouldn't be, because I feel as though they should work hand in hand. You have students that are waiting for months to try and get an appointment with their advisor.
At post-secondary schools, support can come in many forms. There are counseling appointments, which we've discussed, and there are also academic accommodations. So that's things like extra time on assignments, a separate quiet room, or even noise-canceling headphones during an exam. These are offered to students living with disabilities or other mental illnesses in order to help them succeed. Sahar is not saying everyone's experience has been like hers, but she can't get through to accessibility services over the phone anymore. These days, she's redirected to leave a message or to send them an email due to high call volumes. And when we spoke, Sahar had been waiting for a response to a message she left a month ago. The school's website encourages you to come in person for anything urgent.
I will say that I know more professors who are openly telling students that they can be a resource if the students need help. A lot of the time, self-advocacy is all we have, where we have to go to a professor and just kind of hope that they care enough to be like, yeah, sure, you can have this extension.
Sahar has been through a lot to get academic accommodations she needed in the thick of the pandemic.
I always joke that if I knew how daunting and long this process would be, I would not have started.
In short, after lots of paperwork, getting an ADHD diagnosis, and being sent back and forth between doctors and school offices, U of T finally formally recognized Sahar as a student who needed academic accommodations her third year. For her, it's been key to getting professors to accept her need for support.
Some syllabi will have a statement that's like, do not ask for an extension for this assignment. And every time I've been like, but what if I ask through accessibility services? And I've had good success, but it creates a kind of hostile environment where I'm like, I don't know if I can reach out to you.
Between 2013 and 2019, requests for academic accommodations went up by almost 3 times at the University of Toronto. Again, not just a U of T trend, though. All the schools the IJB received data from reported an upward trend in requests for accommodations, too. The reason why mental health care offices are being overwhelmed is still up for debate. We got into reasons why youth may be stressing more than ever before last episode. Experts offer different explanations. One, helicopter parenting that's led to youth becoming more risk-averse and less practiced in overcoming stress. 2, youth ruminating on climate catastrophe and, frankly, bad economic prospects. 3, pandemic isolation. And 4, the role that social media has had rewiring the young brain. These came up as top possible explanations, but there could be another. Here's Sandy Welsh, U of T's Vice Provost of Non-Academic Life again.
We've seen over the last decade or so real destigmatization of mental health issues, and that the generation of students who are with us in university and who are in high school now are a group that talk openly about their mental health challenges. And so that's a good thing. We're also seeing more students coming into university from high school who already have a diagnosis and are needing a check-in with a counselor here or there. And we were seeing students who were in crisis. So I think it was in that context of our concern around some tragic events that were happening on campus in terms of suicides of our students, and wanting to ensure that we were taking a step forward to do a deep dive and look at how can we do better.
I feel very skeptical that these steps that the university has taken will result in the long-term, deep-rooted systemic and cultural change that's really needed to prevent the level of harm that we've seen in students' accounts of the report that I just released.
Jan Lim graduated with honors. Jan's Zoom name listed her pronouns as they and she.
I attended the University of Toronto between 2017 and 2021. I did a major in physiology, and I've been doing clinical physiology research for quite a while. So I have a background in quantitative research.
Back in 2020, Jan asked students to reach out to them if they'd ever experienced negative interactions with the mental health support at school.
And within 48 hours, I had received over 80 responses. I capped the survey at that because at that point I'd received so much data. I pared down the 80 responses to about 60 full-length responses, and I've just spent the last little while taking a look at those. The response was so overwhelming.
And after examining the responses she got, Jan wrote a scathing op-ed in a website called Nouvelle News. That was in 2020. The headline was, "The University of Toronto is harming its students through institutional neglect and psychological violence."
It was disheartening for me to realize as an undergraduate student that it's very unlikely that the University of Toronto or any other academic institution would conduct a systematic analysis into these adverse events, because they unfortunately do reflect quite poorly on the university. The report I've put together is by no means a peer-reviewed academic study at all, but more or less an exploratory, qualitative, survey-based study.
In the fall of 2022, Jan self-published all her findings online in a report called Not Alone. It goes into some numbers, but is predominantly testimonies about adverse events. We'll link to it in our show notes. When I reached out to U of T for a response to both the 2020 op-ed and her 2022 report, U of T Media Relations called me back to point out that this data was all from a time before revamping their services. Professor Sandy Welsh then offered an emailed statement. The email said she was always troubled to hear that students have had negative experiences with mental health supports. She reiterated that the task force consulted students on the challenges, the administration accepted students' proposals in full, and together they created the recommendations to address them. But from the results Jan gathered in her report, she thinks that U of T's new approach is a Band-Aid solution to a problem that the school itself creates.
Quite a few students were struggling as a result of structural problems at the university, whether that be due to very high requirements to enter certain programs or the lack of supports at the various health and wellness centers.
The emphasis on high achievement, as in good grades, was palpable for Jan. And as a current student, Sahar feels it too.
I think that U of T puts a lot of pressure on, I think academia puts a lot of pressure on standardized testing and things like GPA. When I was dealing with anxiety and depression in my first and second years, it was my GPA. I remember I would get I would hear the Outlook notification for school, and my heart would sink. I'd have constant anxiety about it. There have been so many instances of me hearing how the culture at U of T, the competitiveness, the emphasis on standardized testing, the pressure on being the best of the best at an institution where everyone was the best of the best in high school. Everybody was fighting for that 99 average.
This sort of reminds me of that hush that comes over a classroom when a teacher is handing assignments back. There's a certain scene in a movie where the teacher sometimes offers an out loud running commentary like, not your best. I remember the uncomfortable awareness I felt when a person of authority was handing out markers of success. Their nonchalance felt insensitive, and that feeling would metabolize itself to this dread that would whisper in my ear, like, how will this impact what my next steps will look like? Will I get into the school I want, the program I want? Getting grades back was always an exact measure of how good, bad, or average I was.
So I'd say U of T has a reputation, especially in the life science program, for making first and second year unreasonably difficult. There's this idea that floats around of weeding people out and seeing who can last at the institution. And I unfortunately think that that's really true.
I'm curious why they would do that.
I'm going to be honest, I think that they take pride in having low averages. There are so many classes that get curved downward. I think that having difficult classes makes it seem like, oh, but you succeeded. You're actually the best. I think that the reason why people feel like, oh, but I went to U of T, that's better than everything else, is because they go through so much that they're like, it has to be for something. And so I think that U of T has just done really well at keeping this prestigious persona, and then through that can get away with making it unnecessarily difficult.
I had interviewed Sandy Welsh a few days after I'd gotten in touch with Sahar, so I decided to just ask Professor Welsh whether she thought Sahar's impression was true. Weeding out students was by design. Here's what Professor Welsh had to say.
There is a certain reality to that the marks that you receive in first year do come into play in terms of the choice of your major, that choice of that program of study. But it's not about the intentionality of doing that.
Even if it were true that school wasn't intentionally weeding out students, that belief was not the only contributor to a strained academic culture at U of T. Jan's report found that bureaucratic barriers and delays led to students feeling unsupported by the school.
The services were completely inaccessible in that students had never been made aware of these services and were not able to locate these services either online or, through their student college resources. On page 33, there's a section on just a lack of services in general.
Now, U of T has addressed the lack of counseling appointments by implementing stepped care in theory. U of T has also redesigned its wellness services website to make information more accessible. But Jan had other problems with this initiative and its press release from the beginning of the school year.
There was still very much a tone that students need to take more responsibility for their own mental wellness. And by increasing students' awareness and access through the step care model, through Navi.
That's this online chatbot that can point you to resources through various automated prompts.
Through, the online centralized website, everything will be solved, that we will see a dramatic increase in students' mental wellness. And while these are all steps in the right direction, and I definitely applaud the university for putting together the task force, putting together these resources, based off of the research that I collected and based off my own personal experiences as a student, it is not enough.
I asked Dr. Levinson, U of T's clinical lead, about putting too much on students rather than acknowledging the institution's role. How do you balance placing too much onus on an 18 to 25-year-old and being, a caring health provider?
It's a very good question, and it's a kind of common tension. If we think the whole developmental context of most students, they fit into this cohort of what we'd call transitional youth or emerging adulthood. So it's an extended frame of individuation, of self-exploration, of developing autonomy and self-advocacy. And that's a normal developmental piece that you want to support. And it's about really being developmentally aware as a healthcare provider and noting when you really do need to step in.
Where is that point for you when you feel like you need to step in?
It's very individually based in the clinical work. But I think what the task force did was it developed recommendations around thinking about more on a systemic basis. How do we create and support a culture of caring?
Jan seemed to find that previously, that culture of caring sometimes wasn't extended to international students in the same way. They found there were international students who were directed to private services,
which are very difficult for international students to find if they're not Canadian citizens.
In a follow-up emailed statement, Professor Welsh wrote that even though all U of T students have access to on-campus mental health services, students must physically be located in Ontario to receive care. This regulation is based on professional licensing requirements governed by provincial legislation. And this feels a little contradictory, but Professor Welsh said for students located internationally, U of T provides 24/7 digital supports and phone counseling. There are times when we refer students to community resources to ensure that they receive the care they need. U of T's Health and Wellness Centers facilitates those referrals. This leads me to one other school policy that specifically seemed to have a chilling effect on seeking help: the university mandated leave of absence policy.
The leave of absence policy was a large reason why a lot of students came to me anonymously, for example, initially, or connected with me over Gmail instead of my U of T email, because there was so much fear that the institution would remove students that, were feeling intensely suicidal, as they have, in the past.
The University of Toronto announced the implementation of the policy in 2018. The policy is supposed to give students the option to take medical leave without, quote, disciplinary measures. But Jan received testimonies about how a leave actually seemed forced and punitive.
Quote, I wanted to get help last year at school because I was really struggling with my mental health, and I talked to one of my TAs about it. She told me, do not go for counseling at U of T because if they find out you're suicidal, they'll make you take a mandatory semester break. One of her friends, she was feeling suicidal and they literally kicked her out for a semester. She lost all of her progress and marks and everything and had to start over, unquote.
In an emailed statement, Professor Welsh said that this was an example of a, quote, common misperception of the policy. It does not reflect its intent. The intention is compassionate. But at what point does impact outweigh intent? According to Professor Welsh, the policy is not used very often, on average 4 times a year. Do you think there's a place for a policy like this on university campuses?
I do. By placing a student on the leave, we're not just saying you're on a leave, see you later. What we're doing is prior to that leave, I have to, it's in the policy, I bring together all of the offices and staff who may be supporting the student already. And before we would place a student on leave, I would be asking, can we do more? All of the times that we've used the policy have been when there's been a significant community safety risk, where we've had people afraid or people who have actually been physically hurt. And a lot of those folks understand that this is someone with a significant mental health issue.
For instance, one time, the university made a student go to the hospital.
So to give a little bit of background, this student, pseudonym Sky, identifies as a cisgendered woman and was in her 4th year of studies. She studied applied sciences and had a roommate who actually died by suicide. She herself had begun to feel intensely suicidal and spent a night in admission at CAMH. Upon returning, quote, I was forced to sign a contract that said if I were a danger to myself, they are well within their rights to revoke my residency without a refund, and that I would be removed from the premises under the pretense of getting help. My scholarship check from an outside organization covers my residency, and so without a refund, I would have nothing because I come from a very low socioeconomic background. I signed it, but I didn't know that I could legally contest the contract and didn't have to sign it.
She didn't know what her rights were, and she didn't have the access to find out.
I'm a first generation university student, so I'm not at all informed on the legality of these things. A friend later had a similar experience, but her lawyer had gotten involved, and so she didn't have to. I don't have a lawyer, unquote.
Reviewing this policy was Recommendation 18 from the task force, and the university just completed it this past February 2023. Professor Sandy Welsh said the review was meant
to ensure that we're in compliance with human rights, we're in compliance with what is best practices in terms of students who have significant mental health and health issues.
And the review confirmed that this leave of absence policy had a place on campus. It suggested a rename to more accurately reflect the purpose and options contained in the policy. It also suggested adding clarifying language within the policy on what a mandatory versus discretionary leave would look like, and it reiterated that students need to have tried other supports before they're told to leave. Lastly, it reinforced U of T's obligation to provide necessary accommodation, quote, up to the point of undue hardship. The policy is now called the Supportive Leave Policy. Now, U of T is not the only school in Ontario or even the country that has a policy like this. In a review of 21 schools, the IJB found more than half had some kind of removal or involuntary leave policy, or they were in the process of drafting one. Regardless, the one thing that feels most striking to me in Jan's report is the demographics of who feels unsupported. Out of the people who came forward with negative experiences with U of T's mental health care system, 70% of people were women, 40% low income, and 60% racialized. Above all, Jan's report drove home how equity-seeking groups in our Canadian context were the hardest hit when mental health support falls short.
The university really needs to take a look at how its, college residency policies are affecting students, how its academic accommodation and requirement policies are affecting students, how international students are navigating financial resources, how low-income students are managing at the school. There are a lot of structural problems that need to be taken a look at.
How do you think we balance that culture of excellence, rigor, with mental health?
No, I think it's an excellent question.
That's Santa Ono.
He, him, his. I'm the 15th president of the University of Michigan, and I was the 15th president of University of British Columbia before that. And I'm also a husband and a father, and I tried to play the cello.
He's an academic administrator who thinks along the same lines as Jan.
And I often wonder whether the systems that exist are the right ones, not only for mental health, but also for nurturing the next generation of scholars or whatever profession they might choose.
As someone who grew up with his own mental health struggles, Professor Ono is a staunch youth mental health advocate today.
I had a very difficult youth. I attempted suicide at the age of 14 and also in my 20s.
He really credits his lived experiences for his advocacy.
And the reason why I do this really on the side is because I don't want other youth and young adults to go through what I went through when I was their age. And so, I spend time trying to advocate for more resource. I do everything I can in the institutions that I serve to stand up support mechanisms.
When we chatted, Professor Ono kind of confirmed what Sahar and Jan said. They had both pointed to competing for grades, and Professor Ono had noticed how grades were playing an even more central role these days.
But numbers are an imperfect assessment of an individual's qualities and potential. It's a snapshot in time, and it doesn't take into account that young person's circumstance.
For Professor Ono, letter grades or percentage grades can incorrectly assume a level playing field.
Their grades might have suffered because they've lost a parent, or they might be in a household with less fortunate circumstances. I think it's also very, very important recognizing that people have challenges, to let them go on leave and to return, to be flexible in terms of length of time. And if they are a scholarship student, which might have a minimal grade threshold to retain that financial aid or that bursary, that there's flexibility with that, which is much more human and isn't so black and white.
It sounds like he's saying here that concessions like responsive academic accommodations are a key part to balancing the high stress that students experience on campus. And I don't think anyone is advocating for doing away with grades completely. But there are ways that we could make grades more mental health friendly. You may remember Professor Kim Hellmans, the neuroscientist from episode 1. Professor Hellmans explained to me how a stressor activates a chemical and physical response in humans or students' brains. Cortisol and adrenaline send signals to fight, flight, freeze, or fawn for the sake of survival. She also explained how frontal lobes, which control stress hormones, aren't fully formed among young adults until they're 25. Not to mention,
the problem is, in this day and age, do the stressors really ever end? And are we running, or are we fighting? No. So all this cortisol and adrenaline is coursing through our bodies as we sit in front of our computers. So we're not really doing anything with our body, right? So it's kind of sitting there, right? And we're having our heart pumping as we're, having a conversation with a friend, or sitting in a lecture hall, not understanding what my professor is saying.
a therapist once told me to help my body understand a stressor is over, a physical activity like a quick walk or even a body shake could help. She told me that if you see a squirrel fall out of a tree, you'll see it do a little shake because the stress of falling is over. As the Associate Dean of Science at Carleton, Professor Hellmans plays a key role in curriculum design and planning learning outcomes. She says that educating staff on how to foster good mental health is also part of the picture.
We do have faculty that say, this is not my job. I'm here to teach physics, or I'm here to teach math. But there are several who are keen and say, yeah, I'd appreciate some advice or tips on how to have that approach in my coursework. In my experience, I've been teaching, 15 years. What students feel the most stressed about is lack of clarity, don't know how to study, expectations are not known, and unfairness, right? And so those things really make a student freak out, right?
And so in the context of school, Dr. Hellmans suggests communicating when an academic stressor is over. One way to do that is making learning outcomes both specific and clear in syllabi. Dr. Hellmans also suggests reducing assignments that are worth a ton, at least to start.
A good example, what I would consider as a good teaching practice, is allowing for mistakability. When we assign small assignments so students can learn to fail, right? Where they have opportunities to get feedback throughout the way, and that I'm saying, okay, I'm going to drop your lowest 2 marks so that you aren't going to panic because your first 2 assignments, you're getting a lower grade than you would expect, particularly when you're entering as a first-year student.
But all that said, Dr. Hellmans, I think rightfully, doesn't let students off the hook either.
The challenge I see is that a lot of students try to delay the stress. They say, I can't do this because I'm feeling stressed, because I think stress has now become a dirty word, right? So I should wait to write my exam or to do my paper until I'm not feeling stressed. Now, in the face of mild to moderate controllable stressors like university situations, I'm not talking about things like systemic racism or issues like that, which I definitely don't call on us to be resilient, but these other situations, it's like a muscle. Every time you face a stressor, you cope with it, you overcome it, it then allows us to have that flexibility of thinking to be able to manage that stressor in the future.
in the event of a crisis, there really needs to be those material resources, and it would be great to see the university commit more material resources to this issue. The one thing that they won't invest in is their students.
U of T wouldn't put a dollar amount on how much more money they spent to get where they are today. They wouldn't tell us how many more people they've hired either. Instead, U of T Media Relations offered an emailed statement that said they have invested, quote, significant new resources. Here's the Media Relations email explaining why they couldn't offer specifics. Quote, in a university that spans 3 campuses, 17 faculties and schools, and 7 undergraduate colleges, it is not possible to quantify accurately the net new resources that have been invested in student mental health, and any estimates would likely undervalue the amount of this investment. But to be honest, after talking with all the people we have, I'm not convinced it's only a money thing. Out of all the schools that did provide data on their mental health care budgets to the IJB, all of them reported spending more money on their mental health services over the past 6 to 7 years. And yet, students are still talking about the amount of pressure they're under. Professor Welsh even named that maybe we just put hustle culture on this pedestal.
And I would say, all of us as people who have jobs that we love, we all kind of fall victim to that. I've worked really hard and I'm so stressed and it's a badge of honor.
And if students say it's a culture thing, and faculty members name how this culture is propped up by institutional choices, can the conversation move towards what's fostering the culture? Who benefits from academic rigor or prestige? And what would it take to undo all of that? How badly do we want to undo it for mental health's sake? And honestly, who's to say that students still wouldn't feel the pressure of wanting to succeed if we did? What choices are students left with then?
I would have so many conversations with my sister at the time who was like, listen, I'm glad I got my degree here, but you're having problems with your academics, you procrastinate a lot, and you have to be realistic with yourself if you're gonna do okay at this institution. And I remember not listening to any of that because I was like, but there's prestige here. It's U of T. It doesn't matter. I'm gonna be able to do it because it's U of T, and it's just the best of the best. And I think that academic elitism and that idea of prestige is so toxic, because I think a lot of people go to schools where they're able to thrive and actually feel comfortable at their institution immediately, even if it doesn't have the U of T plaque on it.
Next time, we'll zoom out from schools and examine the province as a whole.
We do not have a system. There is no mental health system.
We'll speak with elected officials about what they've done to improve mental health care.
Someone who criticizes and says that we don't treat mental health like health and that there's a disconnect there is completely and totally wrong.
And we'll talk about a mental health pilot project that might offer some solutions.
It was designed to see, can this work?
Thanks for listening. I know it can be tough to take in, so if you're feeling like you need help, know that you can always call 1-866-585-0445 or text wellness to 6868 for youth or 741-741 for adults. We'll also list some resources in our show notes. In Our Heads is hosted and written by me, Tiff Lam, and co-produced with Matthew O'Mara. Matthew and I also did some additional reporting and edited the show. This show relies on reporting from Generation Distress, an investigative journalism bureau series published in the Toronto Star. The team was led by Robert Cribb, Declan Keogh, Julia Fioni, and Charlie Buckley. This episode got production support from Adit Dixit, Anna Spencer, Lydia Raichin, Sangeeta Patel, Nikki Ashworth, and Jonathan Hallowell. Shahriar Tajvidi is managing editor of podcasts and digital video. Lori Few is executive producer digital at TVO. And John Ferry is VP of Programming and Content. Thanks again for listening.